When you think about the Great Pyramids at Giza, you probably picture ancient Egypt, maybe pharaohs like Khufu building these huge tombs around 2500 BC. That's sort of the standard story, right?
Absolutely. That's the image most of us have, the Giza Plateau, the peak of the Old Kingdom,
Mhm.
built by, lots of skilled workers for their ruler's afterlife.
Right. But what if that whole narrative, as powerful as it is maybe just incomplete? What if the Great Pyramid itself is actually much, much older, and maybe its origins aren't just Egyptian, but tied to a whole different ancient place?
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're looking at sources, particularly Armin Argast's book, Giza and Project Us Babylon, that propose a really different timeline.
A different timeline. How different are we talking?
We're talking thousands of years different from the usual 2500 BC date. The core idea here is that the Great Pyramid could be vastly older, maybe even planned in ancient Babylon, and built for reasons other than just being a pharaoh's tomb.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. Explore these pretty surprising claims, look at the evidence the sources present, and ask, what might they tell us about the real age, the origin, and maybe even the meaning of the Great Pyramid?
Let's get into it. The starting point for this whole alternative timeline, according to the source material, is this idea of a very ancient calendar, and specifically its starting point.
Okay, an ancient calendar. And this isn't just speculation. The source connects it to actual academic work.
Yeah, it does. It references, for instance, the work of a philologist named August Book, who looked into linear chronology and the beginning of time reckoning. And based on that kind of framework, the source pinpoints a very specific date for the start of this ancient calendar.
Which is
July 19th, 5702 BC.
5702 BC. Wow, that's specific. What makes that date so important according to this theory?
Well, the claim is that on that exact date, July 19th, 5702 BC, there were some pretty remarkable astronomical alignments happening right at Giza at sunrise.
Alignments, like what if...
Okay, so picture this. The sun is just below the horizon, but exactly in the northeast. At the very same moment, the star Alnitak, the one in Orion's belt, is sitting precisely in the southeast.
Right.
And at the same time, the constellation Leo, the lion, is rising perfectly horizontally on the eastern horizon. All three things happening together.
Huh. So these three specific celestial events, lining up perfectly at Giza on that one day in 57702 BC, that's presented as the starting gun for this ancient calendar.
That's the argument, yeah. A very precise astronomical marker. And the source says this isn't just a one-off alignment, it connects to other ancient calendrical data, too.
Such as?
Well, take the Sothis period data found at a place called Illahun. So this is the Greek name for Sirius.
Right, the dog star. Its first appearance before sunrise, the heliacal rising, was super important for the Egyptian calendar.
Exactly. Now, that Illahun data is usually dated much later, around 2782 BC. But the source here argues something interesting. It argues that the accurate astronomical data recorded in that 2782 BC period actually repeats or echoes data from a much, much earlier Sothis period specifically, one starting back in 4242 BC.
So the same pattern showing up thousands of years apart.
Kind of like a cyclical confirmation, yeah. The source sees this repetition as evidence validating this earlier timeline, suggesting that sophisticated astronomical knowledge existed way back then.
Does it connect to the regular Egyptian calendar, too? The civil one? You mentioned festivals earlier.
It does. The argument is that even later Egyptian festivals, the ones fixed on specific days in their civil calendar, have astronomical roots that only really make sense if you trace them back to this proposed 5702 BC start.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The Hathor Festival, it's linked to the summer solstice. The source shows that back on July 19th, 5702 BC, the summer solstice actually happened 18 days after that Sothis rising.
Okay, 18 days after. So how does that relate to the festival's date later on?
Well, over thousands of years, because the Earth wobbles on its axis, it's called precession.
Right, the precession of the equinoxes.
Mm-hmm.
It slowly shifts the timing of seasons relative to the stars.
Exactly. So that gap between the Sothis rising and the summer solstice gradually shrank. By around 3100 BC, the summer solstice had actually shifted to occur on the same day as the Sothis rising.
Ah, I see.
So because of that long astronomical shift, the Hathor Festival, celebrating that solstice, eventually got fixed in the calendar on the 19th day of the first month, 1 Atshet 19. The source argues that tracking this shift, using other evidence like alignments in temples, such as the Satis Temple at Elephantine, confirms the underlying system started way back.
So the later calendar kind of holds a memory, an astronomical fingerprint, of that 5702 BC starting point at Giza.
That's the core idea presented. All these astronomical and calendar details are shown as being very precise, very interconnected, suggesting, a highly advanced civilization existed well before 3100 BC, much earlier than usually thought.
Okay, so we've got this calendar starting in 5702 BC, linked to Giza alignments and these echoes in later data. But the Great Pyramid itself, was it built then?
Not exactly then, according to the source. The construction is dated a bit later, but still incredibly early. The theory proposes that the actual building of the Great Pyramid started in 54555 BC.
5455 BC. Okay, wait, that's almost 3,000 years before Khufu.
Yeah.
That's a massive difference. Where does that number, 5455 BC, come from?
The main evidence cited for that specific year comes from, again, astronomical alignments, but this time built into the pyramid itself, specifically those famous shafts.
The star shafts, right? The ones pointing out from the king's and queen's chambers. People have talked about those aligning with stars before.
They have, but here's the crucial twist in our guest's work. The source argues that the significant alignments of the northern shafts and the southern shafts occurred in 54455 BC, and they correlated precisely with stars from the Babylonian sky.
Babylonian, not Egyptian constellations.
Exactly. Not the stars typically associated with Egyptian astronomy for later periods. The alignment is claimed to be with stars as recognized or mapped in ancient Babylonia.
So the implication is the blueprint, the design, wasn't originally Egyptian.
That's the connection the source draws. This specific alignment with Babylonian stars in 5455 BC is presented as, well, pretty strong evidence suggesting the detailed planning for the Great Pyramid didn't happen in Egypt, it happened in Babylon.
Which is a major center for astronomy in the ancient world, of course.
A very famous one, yes. The source even floats the idea that the angle of one of the northern shafts might subtly correspond to Babylon's latitude, almost like a hidden signature pointing back to the origin of the plan.
Okay, let me get this straight. The theory isn't just that the pyramid is older, but that it was potentially designed by a different culture, linking Giza and Babylon thousands of years before we usually think either place was doing something like this.
That's precisely it. It fundamentally challenges the standard historical sequence. That 5455 BC date is thrown down against the conventional 2500 BC, highlighting this huge gap.
What about other theories, like the popular one connecting the pyramid's layout to Orion's belt around 10,500 BC, sometimes linked to Atlantis ideas? How does this source view that?
The source acknowledges that Orion correlation theory, it has its appeal, and some serious researchers support parts of it. But it apparently found the specific 10,500 BC date, especially when tied tightly to Plato's Atlantis narrative, less convincing when looking closely at the details.
It's less convincing than its own proposed dates.
Yes. The source seems to find the 5702 BC Giza alignment for the calendar start and the 5455 BC shaft alignments tied to Babylonian stars for the construction start more compelling. Why? Because they claim these are verifiable through very precise astronomical calculations and seem to connect directly to known, albeit reinterpreted, ancient calendar systems.
Okay, let's talk physical evidence, stuff actually found in the pyramid. What about those wood fragments found in the shafts? Didn't people like Flinders Petrie and later the Dixon brothers find pieces of wood? They've been carbon dated, haven't they?
They have, yes, the so-called Dixon relics and other fragments. And the C14 dating on those typically comes back somewhere in the range of, say, 3341 BC to 3 after 94 BC.
Right. So that's much later than the 5455 BC, although still quite a bit earlier than the standard 2500 BC date. Doesn't that carbon dating kind of sink the 5455 BC theory?
Well, this is obviously a critical point, and the source addresses it directly. It acknowledges those C14 dates, absolutely, but it argues they don't necessarily date the original construction of the pyramid itself.
How so? What's the alternative explanation?
The interpretation offered is that these bits of wood might have gotten into the shafts much, much later, perhaps around 3000 BC, maybe during later attempts to explore or search inside the shafts for something.
So the wood isn't leftover scaffolding from 5455 BC, but maybe debris from explorers thousands of years later.
That's the hypothesis presented. Therefore, the source concludes that the C14 dating of these particular fragments is, let's say, uncertain evidence for dating the initial build. It argues it doesn't rule out the possibility of a much earlier construction. It's an attempt to reconcile the physical data with the astronomical timeline.
Interesting. And what about recent discoveries, like the Scan Pyramids project using modern tech to find hidden voids?
Yes, scan pyramids. Since about 2015, they've used things like cosmic ray muon imaging to confirm there are previously unknown large voids inside the Great Pyramid, like the scan pyramid's big void above the Grand Gallery.
How does the source incorporate that?
Well, it notes the somewhat slow pace, maybe surprisingly slow, in actually getting physical access to explore these voids after they were detected. And then there's speculation.
Speculation about what might be inside.
Or not inside.
Exactly. The source suggests that if these newly found chambers are eventually explored and turn out to be empty, well, that could lend more weight to the idea that the pyramid wasn't built primarily as a tomb.
Because the king's chamber itself is famously empty of a mummy or burial goods.
Right. That's always been a bit of a puzzle for the straightforward tomb theory. So finding more large, empty chambers would just sort of deepen that mystery and perhaps support alternative purpose theories. Okay, so we have this proposed chain. Calendar start, 5702 BC, Babylonian planning, Egyptian construction, 544-55 BC, interpreting C14 dates differently, seeing potential support in empty chambers. But where did the knowledge come from to do all this astronomical planning back then?
That's the big question, isn't it? The sheer precision implied, especially if it dates back that far, points to a really sophisticated understanding of the cosmos. The source circles back to Babylon as the planning hub and suggests maybe the actual builders or the knowledge keepers originated from even further back, maybe from Sumer, often called the oldest civilization down in Mesopotamia.
And does the source link this ancient knowledge to specific figures from mythology or ancient traditions?
It does draw on those traditions, yeah. It mentions figures often associated with transmitting wisdom, especially astronomical and calendar knowledge. Names like Thoth, Hermes Trismegistus, Enoch, even Seth from the biblical genealogies.
Seth, son of Adam.
According to some traditions cited in the source, yes. Some lines of thought apparently connect Seth with the very first Thoth or Hermes figure and credit him with founding astronomy itself, which, if you follow the source's timeline, would place these foundational knowledge figures right near that proposed 5702 BC starting point.
So the knowledge might trace back to figures from the absolute dawn of time, as recorded in some ancient texts, maybe even pre-human or partly divine.
That seems to be the implication explored. The source also brings up things like the Sumerian king list, which talks about kingship descending from heaven, and other myths that hint at knowledge coming from divine or non-human sources. It opens the door to the idea that the original civilization and its advanced understanding might have had, well, let's say, unconventional origins.
Okay, so if the Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb for Khufu built around 2500 BC, what was its purpose, according to this alternative view? Why build something so massive, so precise, way back in 5 before 55 BC?
This is where the source gets into some really fascinating, though admittedly more speculative, territory. If you set aside the tomb idea, given the lack of burial evidence and maybe these empty new chambers, what else could it be?
What possibilities does it raise?
Well, the most, let's say, out there possibility mentioned is related to the sheer scale and precision. Could it have been built not by humans, as we typically think of them in that era, but by something else?
Something else. Like who?
The source uses names like Thoth again, or hints at maybe beings from a higher dimension. It draws parallels to myths where gods seem to just appear or disappear or move through walls, abilities that, some highly speculative modern physics ideas touch upon in relation to higher dimensions.
Wow. Okay, so maybe not human builders at all. A divine or extra-dimensional project. That's a pretty radical thought.
It is definitely presented as a speculative possibility to consider within this framework. And if that were the case, the source suggests maybe the king's chamber wasn't for a burial, but for something completely different, maybe an energetic function or initiation.
Initiation rituals.
Yeah, or perhaps even a technological device in a way we don't understand. Maybe a means to access other states of consciousness or even other dimensions. It connects this to stories of ancient sages studying at places like Heliopolis and possibly undergoing profound experiences, initiations, maybe within the pyramid itself.
This whole timeline, starting way back in 5702 BC, building in 5 before 55 BC, it places this high civilization deep in what we think of as prehistory. Did it just continue smoothly, or does the source suggest something happened? A break?
The sources definitely weave in evidence suggesting a major disruption, a global catastrophe, basically, happening after this initial period. There are pointers clustering around the date 3102 BC, That date comes up in various contexts. It's the traditional start date for the Kali Yuga in Hindu cosmology, for instance. And there are specific astronomical alignments noted around then involving stars like Alnitak and Aldebaran.
And that whole period, roughly 3100 to 3500 BC, that time frame pops up elsewhere too, doesn't it, in terms of environmental change?
Yes, exactly. That window aligns pretty well with evidence from geology and archaeology for major climate shifts, sea level changes, and significantly, with the timing of numerous widespread flood myths from cultures all over the world.
Like Noah's flood or...
Yeah, the source mentions the Sumerian Atrahasis story, the biblical flood, the Greek myth of Deucalion, and it even interprets Plato's Atlantis story as being, at its core, a memory of a massive flood event.
But Plato put Atlantis much earlier, didn't he? Like 9,000 years before his time, closer to 9600 BC. How does the source reconcile that?
It offers a potential explanation for the discrepancy. It suggests that maybe the number given by the Egyptian priests Solon, the 9,000 years, was misinterpreted or perhaps exaggerated in transmission. Maybe it was originally something like 3,000 years, or perhaps the number referred to lunar cycles, not solar years, or some other scaling factor was lost if the timescale was shorter.
Then the Atlantis catastrophe could potentially fall within that 3,500, 3,100 BC window.
Exactly. It could potentially link the Atlantis legend directly to this period of global environmental upheaval and these widespread flood narratives. It brings Atlantis into the same time frame as this proposed disruption of the earlier high civilization.
It's really quite something how this theory pulls together threads from astronomy, ancient calendars, myth, reinterpretations of physical evidence like C14 and the new voids. It constructs a completely different historical narrative for the pyramid.
It absolutely does. It paints a picture of a Great Pyramid built way back in 54-55 BC, planned perhaps in Babylon or Sumer, based on incredibly advanced astronomical knowledge, possibly from ancient, maybe even non-human sources. A structure marking a calendar that began in 5702 DC, serving some purpose far beyond a tomb, all before a massive global catastrophe around 3100 BC changed everything.
It certainly makes you look at that familiar shape on the Giza Plateau in a whole new light.
Definitely. Now, we have to stress this is a theory presented in these specific sources. It's a perspective that stands quite far apart from the mainstream Egyptological consensus, which interprets the evidence very differently. The source is making its case based on its specific reading of astronomical data, ancient texts, and physical finds.
So the final thought for you, listening in. If this alternative timeline holds even some truth, if the Great Pyramid is thousands of years older, built with such incredible precision based on knowledge from maybe Sumer or even further back,
Yeah.
what else don't we know? What other secrets about our deep past are waiting to be uncovered?
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What might actually be inside those newly discovered chambers scan pyramids found? Are they empty, supporting the not a tomb idea, as the source speculates? Or could they hold something physical, some clue that might finally give us a clearer answer about the pyramid's true age, its builders, and its original purpose?
The mystery, as always, continues. This has been another deep dive.